The most dangerous lies are the ones people laugh at before they have to live with them. The ballroom of the historic Seacliff Grand Hotel shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, every glass raised in celebration as Carmel by the Sea's wealthiest families gathered for the annual Harbor Legacy Foundation Gala. Graham Mercer stood at the center of the room, exactly where everyone expected him to be. At 6'3", dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, he carried the quiet confidence of a man who had spent 2 decades building an empire that stretched across shipping ports, luxury terminals, and international trade routes. His influence reached far beyond California, yet he never needed to raise his voice for anyone to listen. The conversations around him naturally slowed whenever he spoke. Across the ballroom, Claire Mercer adjusted the sleeve of her midnight blue dress before greeting another donor with her calm, effortless smile. She had spent the evening discussing the preservation of historical artwork for the museum restoration project she directed, far more interested in faded oil paintings than expensive watches or corporate politics. She had always preferred restoring forgotten beauty over chasing attention. It was one of the countless things Graham had admired once, though he had not mentioned it in years. A burst of laughter rose from the cluster of executives surrounding him. Someone had made another joke about celebrity scandals and broken marriages. One investor smirked as he swirled a glass of sparkling water. "Come on, Graham. A man with your schedule? Don't tell me temptation never knocks." Graham loosened one cuff with casual confidence. "Temptation is easy," he said. "Managing people is harder." More laughter followed. Another businessman leaned closer. "What if your wife ever caught you cheating?" Graham smiled without hesitation, almost amused by how ridiculous the question sounded to him. "If my wife ever caught me cheating," he paused just long enough for everyone to wait for the punchline. "I'd blame her." The circle erupted. Glasses lifted. Several men laughed harder than the joke deserved. Someone slapped Graham lightly on the shoulder. Another called it the quote of the night. Graham accepted the reaction with the same detached smile he wore during board meetings, never realizing that the only opinion in the room that truly mattered had not laughed at all. Claire had stopped only a few steps behind the group while searching for a volunteer coordinator. She heard every word with perfect clarity. She did not interrupt. She did not gasp. She did not demand an explanation. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her untouched glass for only a second before relaxing again. She looked at Graham as if seeing a portrait whose hidden cracks had finally appeared beneath the varnish. Then she quietly placed her glass on a nearby tray and continued walking without changing her pace. No one noticed except an elderly violinist whose music briefly faltered before finding its rhythm again. Graham never turned around. The gala continued as though nothing had happened. Speeches celebrated generosity. Cameras flashed. Donors applauded record-breaking contributions. Graham delivered a polished keynote about responsibility, loyalty, and legacy, receiving a standing ovation from hundreds of guests. Claire applauded politely with everyone else. Her expression remained composed, impossible to read beneath the warm ballroom lights. Hours later, the black luxury sedan rolled through the silent streets toward their oceanfront home overlooking the Pacific. Rain had begun to collect on the windshield, soft enough to blur the streetlights into golden ribbons. Graham answered emails from the back seat without looking up. Claire watched the coastline disappear behind the fog. The silence between them felt ordinary, almost familiar, yet something invisible had shifted forever. When they arrived home, Graham loosened his tie and headed toward his office to prepare for an early conference call in Singapore. Claire walked upstairs, removed the diamond earrings she had worn for the gala, folded them carefully into their velvet case, and opened the bedroom window just enough to hear the waves below. For years, she had waited awake every night until Graham finished working, leaving a warm cup of chamomile tea on the small table beside his chair before going to bed. That evening, the table remained empty. Downstairs, Graham eventually stepped into the quiet living room and paused for reasons he could not explain. He glanced toward the side table where the tea usually waited. There was nothing there except the reflection of rain against the dark glass doors. He looked at it for only a moment before convincing himself it meant nothing at all. The following Monday arrived with the same flawless routine the Mercer household had followed for years, yet every familiar detail carried a subtle difference that Graham could not name. At exactly 6:30 a.m., the ocean mist drifted across the wide windows of their Carmel by the Sea home, while the first rays of sunlight settled over the cliffs beyond the backyard. Graham walked downstairs after finishing his workout, already reviewing the morning's market reports on his tablet. The kitchen was spotless. Fresh coffee had been brewed. Breakfast rested beneath a polished silver cover to keep it warm. Everything appeared exactly as it always had. Everything except Claire. She was already gone. A handwritten note rested beside the coffee pot. Museum restoration meeting. Don't wait for dinner if your schedule changes. Claire. The handwriting was neat, graceful, almost elegant enough to belong inside one of the antique journals she restored. Graham glanced at the note for only a second before slipping it beneath a stack of financial papers. She had meetings. He had meetings. Nothing unusual. At least that was what he told himself. The week unfolded with remarkable efficiency. Claire continued managing the restoration studio with the same quiet professionalism that had earned her respect throughout California's museum community. Graham expanded negotiations with an East Coast shipping partner while preparing for an international logistics summit. Their calendars remained full. Their conversations remained polite. Good morning. Drive safely. Dinner is in the oven if you get home late. Not one sentence carried anger. Not one word sounded cold. Yet something had disappeared from between those perfectly measured exchanges. On Wednesday evening, Graham returned home shortly after 9. Normally, Claire would still be sitting in the sunroom reading conservation reports while waiting for him to finish the day. She had never asked him to hurry home. She had simply been there. This time the room was empty. Only a reading lamp illuminated an unfinished book resting on the side table. He looked toward the kitchen. Dinner had been prepared, labeled, and placed inside the warming drawer. A small digital timer displayed how long it had been waiting. 38 minutes. He ate alone in complete silence except for the distant sound of waves striking the rocks below the property. The food tasted exactly as it always had. Somehow, it felt different. On Thursday afternoon, Graham's executive assistant reminded him that Claire's museum had been featured in a regional arts publication. Mrs. Mercer did an impressive interview, she said while organizing his schedule. She spoke about preserving stories instead of replacing them. Graham nodded without looking up from a contract. That's good. The assistant hesitated before leaving. You might enjoy reading it. He intended to. Instead, another conference call filled the afternoon, followed by investors arriving from Seattle. By the time he remembered the article, it was nearly midnight. Friday brought another charity luncheon. Several board members greeted Graham with admiration, complimenting his leadership during a volatile quarter. One of them smiled. Your wife wasn't able to attend. Graham answered automatically. She had commitments. The conversation moved on without another thought, but later that afternoon, he realized he had not actually asked Claire where she had been. Before, he always knew. Not because he checked on her. Because she told him. She shared the small moments of her day while he answered emails, adjusted his watch, or prepared for another meeting. Somewhere along the way, those conversations had quietly stopped. That evening, Graham entered the garage just as Claire stepped out of her SUV carrying a long wooden crate marked with museum handling labels. Without speaking, he walked over and lifted one side before she could ask for help. Together, they carried it into the studio attached to the house. She unlocked the door and switched on the soft overhead lights. Half-restored paintings lined the walls beneath protective coverings. The scent of aged wood and conservation varnish filled the room. Graham set the crate down carefully. Where should this go? He asked. Claire pointed toward a work table. Right there. Thank you. He waited, expecting the conversation to continue. It didn't. She immediately began examining the shipment, checking inventory against a clipboard with complete concentration. She wasn't ignoring him. She simply wasn't inviting him into her world anymore. Graham stood there for another few seconds before quietly leaving the studio. As he closed the door behind him, he noticed something that had once seemed too ordinary to remember. Every evening for years, Claire had looked up whenever he walked into a room. Tonight, she never lifted her eyes at all. By the second week, the silence had become so ordinary that it almost felt intentional, as if the house itself had learned not to expect conversations after sunset. Graham's schedule remained relentless, filled with conference calls, executive briefings, and negotiations that stretched across multiple time zones. He solved problems worth hundreds of millions of dollars before lunch without showing the slightest sign of pressure. Yet on a gray Tuesday morning, a problem appeared that spreadsheets could not solve. Just after 9, his chief communications officer entered the executive boardroom carrying a tablet instead of the usual presentation folder. Her expression was calm, but not relaxed. We have an issue, she said. Graham looked up from the quarterly projections. How serious? An online publication connected one of our overseas contractors to an environmental compliance investigation. The story isn't fully verified, but several financial outlets have already picked it up. Within an hour, reporters began requesting statements. Investors demanded reassurance. A scheduled partnership announcement was postponed. The board expected Graham to appear before the media by late afternoon. None of it frightened him. Crises had built his reputation. He was known for remaining composed while everyone else rushed toward panic. Still, this situation carried unusual risk because perception mattered as much as facts. His legal team proposed one response. Public relations suggested another. Neither sounded convincing. Graham stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Monterey Bay, watching low clouds drift across the water. For reasons he could not immediately explain, one thought entered his mind before any strategy did. Claire would know how to frame this. She had spent years restoring damaged masterpieces by understanding not only what had been broken, but why people still valued them. She understood trust better than most executives he had ever hired. Without thinking twice, Graham left the office earlier than planned and drove directly to the Museum Restoration Center where Claire supervised a private conservation project. The building occupied a renovated stone warehouse overlooking a quiet harbor. Inside, the air smelled faintly of aged canvas, cedar, and fresh coffee. Soft instrumental music drifted through the workrooms where conservators examined centuries-old paintings beneath adjustable lamps. Graham found Claire standing over a large landscape painting, carefully removing layers of yellowed varnish with steady hands. She noticed him immediately, though she did not appear surprised. She simply removed her gloves and smiled politely. "I wasn't expecting you. Do you have a minute?" he asked. Of course. She led him into a small consultation room lined with reference books and framed sketches. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust particles that floated quietly in the air. Graham explained the developing crisis without exaggeration. Claire listened without interrupting once. When he finished, she remained silent for several seconds, her fingers resting lightly against a closed notebook. "People forgive mistakes more easily than they forgive excuses," she finally said. "Don't defend what hasn't been proven. Tell them exactly what you're doing to find the truth. Confidence isn't pretending everything is perfect. Confidence is showing that you don't hide when questions appear." Graham studied her face. It was thoughtful, professional, calm. The advice was exactly what he had hoped for. "That's better than anything I've heard all morning," he admitted. Claire gave a small nod. "Then I hope it helps." She reached for her notebook again, not because she was dismissing him, but because the conversation had naturally reached its end. Graham remained seated another moment. Normally, she would have asked whether he had eaten lunch, whether he had been sleeping enough, whether the pressure was becoming too much. Today, she asked nothing. She simply offered the guidance he needed and returned to her own responsibilities. As Graham stood to leave, his eyes wandered across a nearby shelf displaying restored family portraits waiting to be delivered back to their owners. Each painting carried tiny cracks that had once threatened to destroy it completely. Claire had never erased those fractures. She had preserved them while making the artwork whole again. Driving back toward headquarters, Graham repeated her words in his mind until they no longer sounded like advice for a press conference. They sounded like something much larger. That afternoon, he addressed reporters without shifting blame, without attacking critics, and without making promises he could not keep. The response surprised analysts. The company's stock stabilized before markets closed. His communications officer smiled for the first time all day. "That was exactly the right message," she said. Graham accepted the compliment with a quiet nod, but his thoughts were somewhere else. He realized Claire had once again protected something he cared about without asking for recognition. The difference was that this time, when the cameras disappeared and the crisis faded into the background, she did not call to ask how everything had gone. And for the first time since they had married, Graham found himself staring at his silent phone long after the workday had ended. Autumn settled quietly over Carmel by the sea, carrying cool ocean air through streets lined with cypress trees as the annual Mercer Foundation Heritage Gala approached once again. For years, Graham and Claire had attended the event together without discussing whether they would go. It had simply been another obligation shared between husband and wife. This year, the assumption lasted until a cream-colored invitation rested unopened on the breakfast table beside Graham's coffee. He noticed Claire reading through restoration notes while finishing her breakfast. "The gala is next Friday," he said. She looked up with the same composed expression she had worn for weeks. "I know. We'll probably need to arrive by 6. Claire folded her notes before answering. "I won't be attending." Graham paused with his coffee cup halfway to the table. You already have plans? Yes. Can they be moved? She shook her head gently. No. Her voice remained calm, free from irritation or defiance. She simply stated a fact. Graham frowned slightly. This event matters to the family. Claire met his eyes for only a moment. So does the opening of the museum's coastal restoration exhibition. It has been scheduled for almost a year. Graham searched his memory. She had mentioned the exhibition months earlier during one of their dinners. He vaguely remembered nodding while answering an email. He had never written the date down. You never reminded me, he said. Claire offered a faint, almost sympathetic smile. I used to. She stood, carried her plate to the sink, and quietly left for work. Graham remained alone in the kitchen, staring at the unopened invitation. Her answer had not sounded rebellious. Somehow, that made it harder to argue against. Throughout the week, preparations for the gala intensified. Graham's executive team reviewed guest lists, seating arrangements, and media schedules. His mother called twice to confirm that Claire had selected a gown appropriate for the evening. Graham hesitated before answering. She won't be coming. A long silence followed. She has another commitment, he added. His mother sounded surprised, but chose not to press further. Then you'll represent the family alone. Friday evening arrived beneath a sky painted with pale orange light fading into the Pacific. Luxury vehicles filled the circular entrance of the Seacliff Grand Hotel as photographers gathered outside the ballroom. Graham stepped from his sedan, wearing another perfectly tailored dark suit. Camera flashes illuminated his face from every direction. Reporters smiled politely before asking the same question in different ways. Mr. Mercer, where is Mrs. Mercer tonight? Will she be joining you later? Has she already arrived? Graham answered each question with measured confidence. She has an important professional engagement this evening. The explanation sounded reasonable. Even so, walking through the grand entrance alone felt strangely unfamiliar. Every previous year, Claire had matched his pace without asking for attention, greeting guests with effortless grace while quietly remembering names, anniversaries, and family stories that Graham often forgot. Tonight, every introduction required more effort than he expected. Across town, inside the Monterey Coastal Art Museum, Claire stood beneath soft gallery lights surrounded by restored paintings rescued from decades of neglect. Museum directors, historians, local artists, and students moved through the exhibition with quiet admiration. Instead of expensive jewelry, Claire wore a simple silver pendant that had belonged to her grandmother. Instead of discussing corporate expansion, she explained how tiny cracks could be preserved without erasing the history beneath them. Her audience listened with genuine interest. At one point, an elderly visitor stopped beside a restored seascape and smiled warmly. You don't repair paintings, he said. You protect their stories. Claire smiled. That's all restoration really is. Back at the gala, Graham delivered another polished speech about leadership, legacy, and responsibility. The applause was generous. Yet as he stepped away from the podium, his eyes instinctively searched the ballroom for someone who was not there. For the first time in years, the empty space beside him drew more attention than the speech itself. Near the end of the evening, one longtime family associate approached him with quiet curiosity. Claire chose her own event tonight. Graham nodded once. The older man smiled thoughtfully rather than critically. Good for her. The words were simple, almost casual, yet they lingered with Graham throughout the drive home. When he reached the house close to midnight, the lights in Claire's studio were still on. Through the window, he saw her carefully removing protective paper from one final painting while speaking with two museum volunteers. She laughed softly at something one of them said. It was not a loud laugh. It was not dramatic. But it was a sound Graham suddenly realized he had not heard inside their home for a very long time. And standing alone in the darkness outside, he understood that the distance between them had not been created by one argument. It had been measured in every moment he had failed to notice the life she had quietly built beyond his shadow. The house felt unusually quiet after the museum exhibition, not because anyone had argued, but because both of them had learned how to move through the same rooms without disturbing the other's peace. Days passed with the rhythm of two successful lives running side by side instead of together. Graham left before sunrise for meetings in San Francisco or Los Angeles. Claire spent long hours inside the restoration studio, where every careful brushstroke demanded patience rather than urgency. Their schedules overlapped only at breakfast and late evening, and even then, their conversations rarely lasted longer than a minute. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Graham returned home earlier than expected after a client postponed a negotiation until the following week. The driveway was empty except for Claire's SUV. He assumed she was working in the studio behind the house. As he crossed the garden, he noticed the studio door standing slightly open. Inside, sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting soft reflections across rows of unfinished paintings. Claire was nowhere in sight. A note rested on the work table beside an old brass desk lamp. Back in 30 minutes. Supplies for the Turner restoration. Graham had no intention of searching through her workspace. He simply wandered slowly between the easels, seeing details he had never noticed before. Shelves held carefully labeled pigments, restoration tools, cotton gloves, handwritten reference cards, and framed photographs of paintings before and after years of careful conservation. Every object had its place. Every process reflected extraordinary discipline. Near the back wall stood a tall wooden cabinet with one drawer left slightly open. As Graham reached to close it, several folded envelopes slid gently onto the floor. He bent down automatically to gather them. None had stamps. None had mailing addresses. Each envelope carried only a date written in Claire's familiar handwriting. Curiosity stopped him for a moment. He knew he should place them back untouched. Instead, almost without thinking, he unfolded the letter lying on top. Today you missed dinner again. I kept your plate warm for 2 hours before putting everything away. I know you're building something important. I only wish I still felt like I was part of it. Graham stared at the page. The handwriting remained steady from beginning to end. There were no accusations, no anger, only quiet honesty. He reached for another letter. It had been written nearly a year later. You remembered every investor's anniversary this month. You forgot ours. I smiled when you apologized because I knew you truly didn't remember. Somehow that hurt more than if you had chosen to ignore it. His chest tightened. He unfolded another. You told a reporter that home is where you find strength before facing the world. I watched the interview alone in the kitchen. I wondered if you realized I was still waiting there. Graham slowly lowered the pages onto the desk. They were not goodbye letters. They were conversations Claire had wanted to have, but never forced him to hear. One by one, she had written them instead of interrupting another meeting, another flight, another conference call. He looked toward the rows of restored paintings surrounding him. For years, he had admired the finished masterpieces displayed in galleries without ever witnessing the painstaking work hidden beneath each repaired surface. Standing inside Claire's studio, he understood that their marriage had followed the opposite path. Everyone admired the finished picture. Only she had seen the cracks spreading underneath. The sound of a vehicle entering the driveway pulled him back to the present. Graham carefully refolded every letter exactly as he had found it, returning each envelope to the drawer with unexpected care. By the time Claire entered carrying 2 paper bags filled with restoration materials, he was standing near the window looking toward the ocean. She smiled politely. You're home early. Graham nodded. The meeting was canceled. She placed the supplies on the work table and noticed the cabinet drawer had been closed. Did you need something? For a brief moment, he considered telling her what had happened. He wanted to admit that he had read words never meant to be discovered that way. Instead, he quietly answered, No, I was just looking around. Claire accepted the answer without questioning it. She slipped on a pair of white conservation gloves and carefully unpacked fragile brushes from protective wrapping. Graham watched her hands move with practiced precision, treating every small object as though it deserved patience. Minutes passed before he finally spoke again. Your work? It takes a long time. Claire smiled faintly without looking up. The things worth saving usually do. Graham said nothing after that. As evening settled over the cliffs outside, he stood in complete silence, realizing that for the first time in his life, he understood his mistake clearly enough to regret it, yet not nearly well enough to know how to begin repairing what he had allowed to break. Monday morning arrived beneath a pale gray sky that blurred the line between the Pacific Ocean and the horizon. Graham stood alone in the kitchen nearly 30 minutes before he normally left for headquarters. For years, his mornings had followed the same precise routine. Coffee, financial reports, phone calls, departure. That morning, he closed the tablet before finishing the headlines and looked toward the staircase instead. A few moments later, Claire came downstairs carrying a portfolio case over one shoulder, already dressed for another day at the museum. She looked slightly surprised to find him still standing there. You're leaving later? She asked. Graham nodded. I moved my first meeting. It wasn't entirely true. He had canceled it. Claire accepted the answer without another question. She reached for the coffee pot. only to pause when she noticed a fresh cup already waiting beside her usual seat. Graham had remembered exactly how she prepared it, with a small amount of cream and no sugar. Claire looked at the cup, then at him. "Thank you," she said softly. She sat down, took one sip, and smiled almost imperceptibly. It was not forgiveness. It was simple appreciation. Graham resisted the urge to say more. The silence no longer felt like something he needed to defeat with explanations. Before leaving, Claire picked up her portfolio and headed toward the front door. Graham opened it before she reached the handle. She gave him another quiet nod before walking to her SUV. He watched until the vehicle disappeared beyond the cypress trees, then closed the door without expecting anything in return. Later that afternoon, instead of asking his assistant to reserve a private dining room for clients, Graham instructed her to clear the final 2 hours of his schedule. She looked genuinely confused. "You have 3 pending meetings. Reschedule them." "To tomorrow?" Graham shook his head. "To next week, if necessary." By 5 o'clock, he was standing inside the Museum Restoration Center carrying 2 plain paper bags from a neighborhood cafe. No flowers. No expensive gifts. Just 2 sandwiches and warm tomato soup packed in insulated containers. Claire looked up from a restoration table where she was examining an 18th century landscape beneath a magnifying lamp. "I thought you had board meetings all evening," she said. "Not today." Graham lifted the bag slightly. "I remembered you usually skip lunch when you're finishing a project." Claire looked at the clock on the wall. It was almost 6. She laughed quietly. "You're right. I did." They sat at a small wooden table near the back of the studio while rain tapped gently against the windows. Around them, unfinished paintings rested beneath protective cloths like stories waiting for another chance. They spoke about ordinary things. A volunteer who had accidentally mislabeled a painting. A new shipping route opening near Seattle. A bakery that had finally reopened after renovations. None of the conversation touched the growing distance between them. Yet for the first time in weeks, the silence between sentences no longer felt uncomfortable. When they finished eating, Graham gathered every container and napkin before Claire could stand. "I'll take care of this," he said. She watched him carry everything to the recycling station across the room. Years earlier, he would have already been checking emails while someone else cleaned the table. Before leaving, Graham noticed a stack of heavy wooden frames waiting to be moved into storage. Without asking, he rolled up his sleeves and carefully carried them one by one into the adjoining archive room. Claire followed, surprised by the quiet determination with which he handled each frame. "You don't have to do that," she said. Graham placed the final frame against the wall with deliberate care. "I know." That single answer lingered longer than any apology could have. As the evening drew to a close, Claire locked the studio while Graham waited beside the entrance instead of walking ahead toward the parking lot. They stepped outside together beneath a light drizzle. He opened an umbrella, not dramatically, simply because it was raining. Claire stood beside him as they crossed the parking lot in unhurried silence. Neither reached for the other's hand. Neither pretended the past had disappeared. When they arrived beside her SUV, Claire paused before unlocking the door. "Thank you for dinner," she said. Graham smiled gently. "It wasn't dinner." She looked at him with quiet curiosity. "No." He shook his head. "It was time." Claire held his gaze for a brief moment before getting into the vehicle. As she drove away, Graham remained standing beneath the fading rain with the closed umbrella resting against his shoulder. He knew one shared meal could not rebuild years of unnoticed absence. But for the first time since that night at the gala, he had done something without expecting praise, immediate results, or even certainty that it mattered. And somewhere beyond the sound of the ocean, the first small crack in his pride had begun to make room for something stronger than control. The first changes were so small that no one inside Graham's company noticed them. He began leaving the office before sunset twice a week instead of after midnight. He silenced his phone during dinner unless the call involved an immediate emergency. He stopped scheduling meetings on Sunday mornings, protecting the one tradition Claire had quietly kept alive even after she stopped expecting him to join her. None of these choices made headlines. None erased the words he had spoken at the gala. They simply became habits repeated often enough that they no longer felt like performances. Claire never praised them. She never questioned them either. She accepted each quiet change the same way she approached restoring damaged paintings, with patience, careful observation, and no rush to declare the work complete. Nearly a month passed before another test arrived. Graham's executive board gathered for an emergency strategy session after a prominent financial magazine announced it was preparing a feature about the Mercer organization. The article would include interviews with senior executives, business partners, and members of the Mercer family. During the meeting, one longtime advisor adjusted his glasses before speaking. Public perception matters more than ever. We should present a unified family image. Another executive nodded. Claire should postpone the museum lecture she scheduled that weekend. The photo session and interviews will require both of you. Graham remained silent while several voices discussed logistics, as though Claire's calendar belonged to the company. Finally, someone slid a revised schedule across the table. We'll have your office notify her this afternoon. Graham looked down at the document. The museum lecture had been circled in red with the word cancel written beside it. Months earlier, he would have signed the approval without reading the rest of the page. Instead, he quietly folded the schedule in half and placed it on the table. No, he said. The room fell silent. One board member leaned forward. Excuse me. Graham met his gaze without raising his voice. Her lecture stays exactly where it is. Another executive frowned. This interview affects the family's reputation. Graham answered calmly. Her work is part of this family's reputation. The magazine expects both of you. Then they'll interview me alone. A few uneasy glances passed around the table. His oldest advisor tried once more. Graham, this is a strategic decision. Graham nodded. It is. That's why I've made it. No one argued after that. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. For the first time in anyone's memory, Graham had protected someone else's commitment instead of asking them to sacrifice it for the business. Late that afternoon, he drove directly to the museum instead of returning home. Claire was preparing slides for her upcoming lecture inside a quiet conference room overlooking the harbor. She looked up as he entered. Everything okay? Graham walked over and placed a folder on the table. The magazine wanted you to cancel your lecture. Claire looked at him with mild surprise. I assumed they might. They won't ask again. She searched his face for a long moment. What happened? I told them your work wasn't moving. Claire remained silent. She slowly closed the presentation folder in front of her. That probably wasn't the easiest decision. Graham gave a small smile. No, thank you. The words were simple, sincere, and nothing more. She did not step closer. She did not erase the distance between them. She simply acknowledged what he had chosen. As evening settled over the coastline, they walked outside together toward the museum parking lot. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and cypress through the fading light. Halfway across the courtyard, a young museum intern hurried toward Claire carrying several heavy presentation boards. I'm sorry, the intern said. I didn't realize how much these weigh. Before Claire could answer, Graham reached for the stack and balanced it easily in his arms. Which room? He asked. Conference Hall B, the intern replied. Graham carried every board down the hallway without another word. Several staff members thanked him as they passed. None recognized him as the powerful executive whose name appeared on magazine covers. At that moment, he was simply a man helping prepare someone else's work. Claire watched from the doorway as he carefully leaned the final display against the wall, checking twice to make sure it would not slide onto the polished floor. She remembered another version of Graham who would have been impatient to leave after 5 minutes. This man never looked at his watch once. As they left the museum together, Claire unlocked her SUV but did not get inside immediately. Instead, she looked toward Graham and held his eyes a little longer than she had in months. She still had not offered forgiveness. She still carried the memory of that night beneath the ballroom lights. But for the first time since everything had changed, she no longer wondered whether his actions were meant to repair his reputation. She began to wonder whether they were slowly changing the man himself. Almost a year had passed since the night a careless joke had echoed beneath crystal chandeliers, and although neither Graham nor Claire ever mentioned it aloud, both of them measured time from that evening forward. Winter had given way to spring, and Carmel by the Sea welcomed another season of ocean fog, blooming gardens, and visitors who admired the peaceful streets without realizing how many quiet battles had been fought inside the homes overlooking the cliffs. Graham's calendar still carried the weight of board meetings, international calls, and negotiations, but something inside those pages had changed. Entire afternoons now remained empty by choice. Family dinners no longer competed with conference calls. More importantly, those decisions had continued long after anyone might have mistaken them for temporary gestures. One Friday afternoon, Graham received a formal invitation to address the annual Mercer Family Leadership Summit, an event attended by executives, investors, and several generations of relatives whose expectations had shaped him since childhood. The ballroom chosen for the summit was the very same room where everything had begun a year earlier. When he stepped inside during rehearsal, he immediately recognized the polished marble floor, the sweeping staircase, and the grand chandelier suspended above the center of the room. His eyes drifted toward the exact corner where he had once laughed, while surrounded by applause. He remained standing there longer than necessary, before quietly walking toward the stage. That evening, he asked Claire if she would attend the summit. She looked up from the restoration journal she had been reading beside the fireplace. "Do you need me there?" she asked. Graham considered the question carefully. A year earlier, he would have answered without thinking. This time, he chose every word. "I'd be honored if you came. But if you already have plans, I'll understand." Claire studied him for several silent seconds. Then she closed the journal and nodded once. "I'll come." The ballroom filled quickly on the night of the summit. Conversations echoed beneath the chandeliers as familiar faces gathered around polished tables dressed in white linen. Graham stood backstage waiting for his introduction, while Claire quietly took her seat near the middle of the room instead of beside the front row reserved for the Mercer family. She had never cared about being seen. The master of ceremonies welcomed Graham with a list of achievements that drew generous applause. He walked to the podium without notes. For several moments, he simply looked across the audience. Then he spoke. "Most people think leadership is measured by the number of people willing to follow you." The room became still. "I spent years believing the same thing." His voice remained calm, steady, almost reflective. "I thought success meant always having an answer, always staying in control, always protecting my reputation." He paused and glanced toward the far side of the ballroom, where laughter had once filled the air. "The biggest mistake I ever made wasn't a business decision. It wasn't a failed investment. It was believing I could protect my pride by placing blame on the one person who had spent years protecting my peace." No one interrupted. Graham did not explain the entire story. He did not mention the conversation word for word. He did not ask for sympathy. Respect isn't something you demand after hurting someone. It's something you practice before they ever have a reason to question it. He looked toward Claire. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. "The strongest person in my life never fought me for power. She simply stopped carrying the weight I should have been carrying beside her. And it took me far too long to understand the difference." Silence settled over the audience. It was not uncomfortable. It was thoughtful. Graham stepped away from the podium before anyone could applaud. For several seconds, no one moved. Then, quietly, the room rose to its feet. The applause that followed sounded different from every standing ovation Graham had ever received. It celebrated honesty rather than achievement. Claire remained seated until the applause softened. She stood only after everyone else had already risen. As guests slowly dispersed, Graham walked toward her without rushing. Neither of them spoke immediately. The ballroom around them gradually emptied until only staff members remained clearing tables beneath the fading lights. Claire looked at him with the same calm expression she had carried through every difficult season of their marriage. "You didn't have to do that publicly," she said. Graham nodded gently. "I know." She lowered her eyes for a brief moment before looking back at him. "I never wanted to hear you apologize." Graham waited. Claire continued softly. "I wanted to know that the man standing beside me understood why those words mattered." Graham answered with complete honesty. "I do now." Claire did not reach for his hand. She did not embrace him. Instead, she stepped forward until the distance between them disappeared for the first time in almost a year. Nothing dramatic happened. No music swelled. No grand declaration filled the room. They simply stood together beneath the same chandelier where everything had once begun, and in that quiet space, Graham realized that earning trust was never about finding the perfect words. It was about becoming the kind of man whose actions finally made those words unnecessary. Summer returned to Carmel by the sea with clear skies and calm tides rolling against the cliffs below the Mercer home. The rhythm of the house had changed so gradually that neither Graham nor Claire could identify the exact day it happened. They no longer lived around each other's schedules. They lived within them. Some mornings Graham left after breakfast because there was no meeting important enough to replace the quiet 20 minutes they now shared at the kitchen table. Some evenings Claire closed the restoration studio before sunset. Not because anyone expected her home, but because she no longer felt she had to prove that her work deserved the same respect as everyone else's. It already had. One Saturday morning, the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the open windows while ocean air carried the sound of distant waves into the kitchen. Graham stood at the counter, carefully preparing breakfast with the same deliberate patience Claire had once shown every evening when she waited for him. He checked the skillet twice. laughed quietly when one piece of toast browned too quickly, and started another without frustration. Years ago, he would have called someone else to finish the task. Now he simply tried again. Claire walked downstairs wearing a light sweater, surprised to find the dining table already set. She smiled as she noticed 2 coffee cups waiting beside warm plates. "You were up early," she said. Graham looked over his shoulder. "I wanted to make sure nothing got cold before you came downstairs." Claire glanced at him for a long moment before taking her seat. She remembered another version of him who had never noticed whether a meal was warm or cold because someone else had always handled those details. They ate without rushing. Outside, sunlight reflected across the Pacific, filling the room with a soft golden glow. After breakfast, Claire disappeared upstairs for several minutes before returning with a small brass key resting in the palm of her hand. She placed it gently beside Graham's coffee cup. He looked at it with quiet curiosity. "What's this?" Claire smiled. "The new studio." Graham looked up. "You found one." She nodded. Months earlier, the museum board had approved funding for a larger conservation space where Claire could lead restoration projects from across the West Coast. She had mentioned the possibility only once, never assuming it would become reality. "The renovation is finished," she said. "The movers are coming Monday." Graham picked up the key carefully, turning it between his fingers. "Congratulations." Claire's smile deepened. "I'd like you to have a copy." He looked genuinely surprised. "Are you sure? It's not because I need someone to unlock the door." She paused. "It's because I'd like you to feel welcome there." Graham closed his hand gently around the key. No expensive gift he had ever received carried the weight of that simple piece of brass. Later that afternoon, they drove together through the quiet streets toward the new studio overlooking a small marina. The restored brick building faced the water, where sailboats drifted slowly beneath a bright blue sky. Inside, sunlight poured across spacious work tables waiting for paintings that had survived generations. Claire walked from room to room explaining where conservation equipment would be installed, where students would work, where finished pieces would eventually be displayed. Graham listened more than he spoke. Occasionally, he asked thoughtful questions. Occasionally, he simply admired the excitement in her voice. Before leaving, Claire unlocked a small office overlooking the harbor. The room was simple: a desk, a bookshelf, 2 chairs beside a large window facing the ocean. Graham stepped inside, while Claire remained by the doorway. He noticed a familiar object resting on the desk. A ceramic mug painted with tiny blue waves. It was the same mug she had used every morning for years before quietly placing it in storage after their lives drifted apart. Claire noticed him looking at it. "I found it while packing." Graham smiled softly. "I thought it had disappeared." "It didn't." She walked over and placed it beside the coffee maker waiting to be connected. "I just stopped taking it out." Graham looked toward the harbor where sunlight danced across the water beyond the window. "I'm glad you brought it back." Claire looked at him, then gently rested her hand over his for the first time since that distant evening beneath the ballroom lights. Neither of them spoke. They no longer needed to revisit old wounds to prove they had healed. As the afternoon breeze moved through the open window, Graham slipped the studio key into his pocket beside his car keys, understanding the difference immediately. One opened a building. The other represented a place in someone's life that could never be demanded, purchased, or controlled. It could only be earned. And as they locked the studio together before walking toward the shoreline, neither of them walked ahead. Neither of them followed behind. For the first time in many years, they matched each other's pace, leaving 2 quiet sets of footprints in the sand as the tide slowly carried the old ones away.